And I'm just like, and I knew, because I knew at that moment that I had to make a decision. Because to ignore the convergence or this divergence, right? To ignore that was me, I guess, personally and publicly in some regards, acknowledging that I'm willing to settle because I'm too afraid to change the environment that I'm in.
This week's episode of the Spirit Change podcast talks about questioning the narratives that you operate from. Today, we are here with Jason Gillette. He is the owner of Guild Health Group, a research and response company that leverages public health methodologies to ask, evaluate, and address challenges. In response, creating programming and leadership development around that topic. Oh my goodness. So welcome to Spirit Change, Jason Gillette of Guild Health. Super excited to have him here. And let me just tell you, you are in for a treat. He is one of the dopest men that I have met in such a long period of time. And let me just tell you, when Jason and I came together, I was in like this crazy space. And when I tell you, he just kind of helped me gather my thoughts and really put a plan in place to move myself forward mentally. And so I can appreciate him. And Jason, thank you so much for being on the Spirit Change podcast. So I want to jump right in and ask you one quick question. Jason, how would you describe yourself in one word and why?
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Angela, for having me on the show. This is pretty cool. I get a chance to share my thoughts with someone I have a great deal of respect for. So this is awesome. Quickly, I guess the word that I believe defines me or represents who I am most accurately is curiosity. I'm a very curious person. I love to learn, and so I oftentimes ask a great deal of questions, because to learn for me is to be inquisitive and to just look at what is the etiology, right, of how these things come to be. And so I love being curious, and I love learning about what there is in all different types of subjects and matters. And so that's who I am. And I'm curious because I love to learn, but on top of that, it goes back to my grandfather. He taught me at an early age that they can take your clothes, they can take your house, they can take your job, but they can't take what you've learned. And so I hold that very true to myself now. And so I keep a spirit of curiosity on me at all times, because you always can learn something that will transform someone's life or your own. So.
Right. Oh, I love that. Curious. Oh my goodness. And I think whenever I think about our interactions, right, we're always diving in deep. How can we learn more? Angela, what are you learning from this specific situation? And what are you going to take from it? So I can definitely appreciate that, Jason. So quickly, as we think about spirit change, right, it's always those moments in our life that are so defining. And oftentimes we don't realize that they're the defining moments because we're kind of stuck. And so I wanted to ask you, what is a spirit change moment today that you want to talk about?
Oh, yeah. One of the most pointed spirit change moments that I can think of is, again, starting the company that I have now. Originally, I thought of being a business owner as something complete outside of my scope, my purview. I thought that was something for people that did business, right? It was more of this transactional understanding of how to make a profit. And in my journey of starting Guild, I didn't have that acumen, right? I wasn't the business savvy person, but I'm a public health person. I love public health. I love working with people. I love understanding systems and the nuances that operate and move those systems forward. And so when starting Guild, my spirit change moment was understanding that I could. Mm-hmm. And it started almost 5 years ago. And I can recall very, very clearly that I was in a space where I had to make a decision, right? Mm-hmm. The current direction that I was going into wasn't for me. I could tell that this was not my space. This is not what I was going to build my legacy on. even if I wanted a legacy, that wasn't the direction in which it was going to happen. And so for me, it was this moment where you had to find out for yourself what you were, who you were, and what you were made of. And so I didn't initially think about opening a business. I just thought of, I need to help, and I don't know exactly how. In the current structure in which I'm being asked to help, I can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was this moment where a friend of mine asked me, you know, is your faith greater than your fear? And I thought that was, I mean, someone who asks you that at work, like that's not something that's, how are you doing? How's your weekend? That's usually your standard work, conversation. But when he asked me that, I didn't know how to respond. I just said, I guess my faith, I consider myself a man of faith. And I thought that, that was great. And so he said, well, if your faith is that great, why are you still here? What are you afraid of? And I didn't know. I had no idea I was afraid of something.
Right.
And what I came to understand is I was afraid of failure because I didn't know. Mm-hmm. It was this stepping out on a unfamiliar ground that I was afraid of, and I couldn't speak that because I didn't quite know that was exactly what was driving me to kind of be reluctant for change. Mm-hmm. And so in my efforts to kind of better understand that and unpack that, he sent me a Zoom, not a Zoom, it was a link to a YouTube video that had this speaker around, is your faith greater than your fear? Mm-hmm. And so he's like, hey, listen to this, and then we'll talk tomorrow. And so I was like, okay, sure. And I left. I got to the gas station. I'm pumping gas as I'm on my way home, and I just pull it up to watch it as I'm pumping gas. And it basically says, if you're afraid of something, it's because you don't believe. Mm. And that struck me. It struck a chord where I'm like, I do believe I can be successful. I do believe I can do these things, but I'm afraid to do them. And I couldn't articulate that. And so at the end of the video, I just saw myself like weeping. And I'm just like, and I knew, because I knew at that moment that I had to make a decision. Right. Because to ignore the convergence or this divergence, right? To ignore that was me, I guess, personally and publicly in some regards, acknowledging that I'm willing to settle because I'm too afraid to change the environment that I'm in. Right. And that was hard for me because I didn't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. And so my moment of spare change was understanding that the narratives that we operate off of are often what make us do or not do the things we're supposed to. And so what I learned in that moment is, what are the narratives what narrative has to be true for you to think, believe, and act the way you're acting. Right. And for example, the narrative that was true for me was that if I moved and switched jobs, I was going to fail. Mm-hmm. And that I was going to lose everything that I had gained. That if I did change jobs, that no one would believe in me and everyone would see me for this person that couldn't hack it and not capable of being successful. Yeah. It was also a narrative that was true that I felt that I couldn't build a business because I didn't know how. And so because I didn't know how, it was just like, don't even try. And so those were narratives that had to be true for me to act and believe and think in the way in which I was thinking. And so I had to make a decision on, is that true? Are those narratives true? And we oftentimes don't ask ourselves that question.
Right. I love that, Jason. I love that. And you talked, there's a lot to unpack in just those few minutes. Oh my gosh, this is why I love you, right? So you talked a bit about, first of all, is your faith greater than your fear, right? And so many times our fear is what leads us. It drives us, right? And so we become stifled. And you asked yourself, were you willing to settle instead of changing your environment, right?
Yes.
And so can we talk a little bit about what really drives your passion for what it is that you do?
Yes. So what drives me? Wow, that's a great question. I think there's a few layers, and I'll try to articulate them best I can. But the first layer is my own uh, willingness to want to be better.
Mhm.
I grew up in a space where that wasn't the norm, right? To show up wasn't the expectation,
Right.
and so I oftentimes didn't know what it meant to show up,
Mhm.
and so what kind of built this my faith, if you will, in this whole idea was that I was better than I was giving myself credit for, but I didn't know how to believe in myself. I didn't know how to change that narrative. I didn't understand that this idea of faith and perseverance, and it was a decision, and it's all a decision. And what I guess what triggered that in me was the idea that once we decide to do something, we have the power to do it.
Right.
And I think that it's those moments. It's understanding um, just the context of what of what you understood to be true, and based on your cultural and historical background,
Mhm.
what you've seen as examples of excellence and the lack thereof in your community, and then exposure to excellence.
Mhm.
Those things kind of had a they had a huge impact on how I saw the world and interacted with the world. I believe
Right.
that that's critical in understanding how we move forward and understand our own personal change.
Right, right. And you think about, Jason, what you have to offer to the world, and you think about Guild Health and the platform that you've created for Guild Health, right? You talked a bit about legacy. And so when I think about just us as a culture, right? And I think about our health, whether that's our physical health, our mental health,
Mm.
I think about the what you bring as a business owner, but then also a minority business owner out into the world, right? And so you think about even how COVID showed all of the inequities that exist, in the healthcare center or healthcare system. And you
Mhm.
think about just even Arizona, right? Not knowing where or how to get the assistance that you need. And so when I think about Guild Health and when I think about the work that you do specifically in showing how the world is maybe a bit imbalanced or how the world could potentially assist and support other people, I think about the impact that you're making, not just only here in Arizona but abroad, right? So let's talk a little bit about, like, if you had a settled, like, how would that have shifted your impact and your influence on the world?
Wow,
Like,
wow. That's it's scary to think. Like if you didn't make that decision, or if you didn't do something,
mhm,
I think that to a legacy, I've always wanted to do something great. Like
mhm,
and it's not that so much that I wanted to be great per se myself, but I just wanted to be involved in something that actually made a difference
right.
in people's lives. And so that was one of the reasons why I got into public health
Mhm,
to begin with, because I see and I believe that people who are healthiest, and I mean comprehensively, right? So we think about Maslow's hierarchy of need. We think about
mhm,
the 8 dimensions of wellness. We think about the system, the policy systems and environments, and social determinants of health models and metrics and surveys that kind of identify these barriers. And my personal belief is that whole people show up. They
mm,
give their best to themselves, to their family, to their community, to their job. They give of themselves at a higher level because they're whole and they're healthy. And so I'm a firm believer that comprehensive health is the linchpin that changes community, changes policy, changes health outcomes, changes poverty rates, it changes life expectancy, because when we are able to show up as our best selves,
mhm,
and I know that sounds outside of the purview of health, but it is just so integral to our health. There's this gap between what we understand to be healthy
mhm,
and what health looks like, and what comprehensive health actually does. It's these measures. How do we know comprehensive health versus just regular biometric or anthropometric health.
Mm-hmm.
They're different, but they are so integral to one another that to exclude one or to separate them is just not, that shows a lack of understanding of health, because they're just so integral. You think about emotional health,
Mm-hmm.
environmental health, social health,
Mm-hmm.
financial health, right? Occupational health. Like, these are all aspects of our lives, and they impact who we are, how we show up, and how long we live, to be quite honest. And so that my legacy and what I feel is important, if I didn't make this decision or make this transition, is I would have given up on the idea that I truly believe that comprehensively healthy people provide and give better to all systems, environments, and policies.
Right, right. I love that. And you even think about the work that you're doing, and how it impacts the next generation. You talked about living longer, but, and if we can dial in just a little bit personal, if you don't mind, but you talk about how you show up your whole person, and also this willingness to be better, right, as an individual. And so when you think about even the life that the legacy that you're leaving for your son, right? You are literally creating this space for him to show up wholly and completely who he is. And so when I think about the work that you do, this is generational. This isn't just about what's going on here, what's going on now, but you're changing the landscape of generations to come. And that's why your work is so important, right? So
thank you. I'm like, oh my God. I feel, I need to do something different. Step up.
No, not at all. Not at all. When you think about just the biggest lesson that you've learned over this time, Jason, what do you think over the past 5 years as an entrepreneur? What's one of the biggest lessons that you learned, and how can our viewers apply it to their lives?
The biggest lesson that I learned is, one, I learned that what narratives do we operate off? Like, I really like it is fascinating because there's this inherent idea that, and I've read this in a few books, but one of them that jumps out of me, Jason Gillette talks about habits and healthy habits. There's this thought or this ideology that we are right, and it's so fascinating because when we know that we're right, then it creates this dichotomy, right? Because then to be right, the opposite of right is wrong. And so it's hard as a society to I guess remove that, or to suspend our ideology of being right? And that spurs from various things, from ethnocentricity to politics to community development of programs, how we evaluate programs, because we have an understanding of what is right. Mm-hmm. We have best practices and evidence-based approaches, but we as individuals, we find out that when we identify what we understand to be right, and this is both from a social context and from a public health perspective, we don't allow for perspective, right? Because when you're right, then everything else is wrong. And so that limits what we're willing to hear, what we're willing to accept, and how we operate. Yeah. And so when we ask ourselves, what must be true for this to be right, or for me to be right? Mm-hmm. When we ask ourselves that, there's another question that comes up, and that's, is this narrative true? Mm-hmm. Is it true about me? Is it true about the information in which I have? Is it true about the population in which I'm working with? Is it true about my abilities? Is the narrative that is creating the behaviors or the feelings or the perspectives that I have, is that narrative true? Right. And so when we can suspend the idea that we are right, then we can ask ourselves that question: is what I know true? Okay. And so, but when we can't, when we're unable to separate ourselves from what we believe to be right, we're unwilling and unable to see perspective, and then therefore we see duplication of efforts, projects not getting done, projects not even getting started. We see mismanagement, poor leadership. We see all these things happen because we are right. Right. And it's just a fundamental thought that I think that if we as individuals would question and suspend the idea that we're right just long enough to see perspective and question our own narrative long enough to see what truly is correct, what
Right.
truly is the appropriate way to do things. And that's a humbling experience for all of us. And I think that the sooner we do that, the better.
I love that. So what narratives are you telling yourself?
Oh my
And
goodness.
and challenge those narratives, right? Are they true?
Are
And
they?
yes. Okay. So I have attempted to remove right or wrong, right and wrong from my vocabulary. I try to identify what is the best possible solution for me to move forward, right? And
Mhm.
then also, what that has given me the opportunity to do is a couple of things. One, so many times when we look at life, we look at it from failures or successes, right? And so if I'm making the best possible choice in this moment, then I'm looking at everything that's presented to me. And now I'm able to move forward. I don't have to get stuck on, did I do the right thing? Or, oh my gosh, I did the wrong thing, right? No, it
Right.
was the best possible solution for me in that moment. And then,
And
well, go ahead, go ahead.
sorry to interject, but there's something you said. You said, what's the best possible solution in this moment? And I think that that's perfect because it allows us to ask the question of what's out there. Right?
Right.
Because to say what's the best possible means that you know that there is something out there, and there are multiple things out there that you can choose from, because there has to be a best and a worst. And so it gives us, again, perspective, and it gives us this context that there's more than just a single way of approaching things. And so that's exactly right. It's what's the best out there. And then it requires us actually to do our due diligence to find out what's out there to begin with. So
Mhm.
we have to open up our perspective to even be willing to look for what else is out there, because we always have this preconceived notion that what we know is right,
Yeah.
and it can't be challenged. And I think that
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. And to your point, when it's right or wrong, you kind of get stuck right there in that moment. And so and then also if you're working with a broader team, it begins to put you on two different sides of the spectrum. You're arguing a position instead of working together to create this space. You mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Psychological
yes,
safety is at the foundation of that.
yes,
And so you eliminate that space for psychological safety and ultimately stifle innovation. And so when you think about entrepreneur and our entrepreneurial journey, we're constantly looking for a space to be agile, a space to be flexible. And so I love that that insight to, challenge the narrative that you're saying to yourself, and
mhm.
determine whether or not it's been true or whether or not it is true. I love
And
that.
there's some instances where it is true, right? So the things that we believe, they are true. For instance, we know that eating poor foods does lead to a lot of different comorbidities. So we know that there are some things that are true, and that's okay. But and I always question and always ask, is there a better way? To your point, is that the best method? Is that the best information we have on this topic? It stands to be true. We
Mhm.
can look at the evidence and say that we can support that, but it's always important to ask that, because if you go in there with this preconceived idea or notion of what you know is accurate
Mhm.
without that checks and balances, that's where we create those challenges.
Mhm. And it goes back to your opening word, which is curiosity.
Yeah,
Being curious, it gives you that space to where you can be curious, you can be inquisitive, you can begin to dig in deeper to find out what are some of the problems in the community, what are some of
yes,
the problems that you can begin to solve. So I want to segue quickly. So May is mental health month. And, yes, this is your jam, right?
right.
So, share a little bit with the audience just about mental health, talk of mind, and just what can they do to support their inner circle with maybe some of the potential challenges that are going on around them.
Absolutely. Yes. So May is, yeah, definitely important for mental health, and I think that my journey in understanding mental health is personal. I've dealt with mental health issues my entire life, and at moments, I think even in my adolescence, I didn't know.
Mhm.
And so I think one of the most impactful uh, pieces of advice that I received was that getting help is okay, like in whatever form that looks like, in regards to getting counseling, or if you are in need of medication or treatment, or the idea of mental health being an ancillary or separate process from our overall comprehensive health, like where the mind goes, the body follows, right? It's in our minds. It's our ability to process information both internally and externally that it gives us the ability to thrive and to better problem solve and to critically think. Mental health is really important. And I've learned that as a Black man, my mental health is different than someone else's, and that's okay. I've also learned that my mental health is my own personal walk, and I have to be okay with it before I can let anyone else be okay with it. And so that journey of mental health awareness and the importance of it took a lot out of me, because most men don't talk about, hey man, I struggle with these things, or I have depression or anxiety, or I'm an introvert. I don't want to be around a lot of people. It takes too much energy out of me. And so the journey for me has been being okay with my mental health ailments and challenges, but also being able to talk about it. And so I created this project called #TalkOfMind to really level the playing field and say, how do we talk about this? Like it's not a thing. And I wish we were able to talk about mental health in the same capacity we talk about going to the gym, right? It's like, hey man, I go to this gym over here. It's great. You should come over. Hey, I have a therapist who helps me, and this is the things that I learned, and this is the tools that I have developed and have used to manage my level of anxiety or my depression or my angst or whatever the case may be. I think that we all suffer in silence because we're not willing to say, man, I struggle with these things too. But on this flip side, how comforting it is to hear someone, a man, woman, or a professional say, yeah, I struggle with some mental health issues, and this is how I'm dealing with them.
Right.
I take these medications to really help me get to a space where I can operate, or I go to therapy weekly, so that way I can not only use the tools, but to evaluate if they're effective. And so I love the idea of #TalkOfMind, because the badges that we provide to customers it's an invitation to talk about mindfulness and mental health, because until we talk about it, it's still taboo. It's still it's getting there, but we need to really have these conversations and be okay with that. Like it's not an indicator that you're broken. It's an indicator that you're human.
Right. And Jason, you hit the nail on the head in a couple of different ways. I mean, first of all, #TalkOfMind, it should be a roadshow. Like you should be out there talking to specifically our Black men about mental health. Because you said it yourself, is that for years, it was just taboo. We were taught to shake things off.
Right.
Men don't cry, men don't talk about it, they don't complain, whatever the case might be. And that bottles up and it shows up in so many different forms, right?
Yes.
Cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, et cetera. And all of it just builds up, and it's just eating our people alive, right? And so, if you can get that on the road, Talk the Mind, it should be a road for sure. Just to give people that freedom to talk about, mental health, and even as a Black woman, being able to express, even I'm upset, people might see that, and they internalize it in such a different way, and I think about even healthcare and all of that. I won't go into the healthcare specifically for African American women. And to your point, the treatments are so different and very, and sometimes biased, right?
Yes.
And so how do we begin to create this space again for health for our Black and brown people?
And it comes through awareness, and it comes through, again, to your point, communities of conversation. It's this normalizing effect, right, of understanding that this is a part of our human experience, that we see things differently, and that not all of our thoughts are ours, and we don't have to operate off of every thought that comes in our mind, and we can decide. And I think that idea of choice it's important to understand how we can operate and use that to our advantage but mental health impacts that.
Yeah.
Understanding that we have choice.
Yeah. And how do we get that help, to your point earlier? How do we get that help to where we're seeing someone weekly or whatever that need is, so that we're not to the point of a breaking point, right?
Exactly.
And so I definitely can appreciate that. Jason, are there any parting words that you would like to share to the audience, or words of wisdom?
You know, my spare change is that I offer, or I'm grateful to share, is that, you know, it sounds silly, but at times it does. But we really can accomplish anything. Like it sounds so cliche. It sounds, you know, rather rudimentary to say, "Oh yeah, you can do it."
Mm-hmm.
But when we understand that we have some level of control over where the ship of life is going in our life. Like we have the hands on the wheel. In a sense, we're not, you know, we're not letting life happen to us, and in allowing ourselves to challenge those narratives, because who we are isn't who we can be. This is constant iteration. Be curious. Who can I be?
Mm-hmm.
What can I learn? What can I change? What scares me? Ask those questions about ourselves, and those give us insight into what really aggravates us, what agitates us, what makes us stop when things get difficult, what makes us, you know, turn tail and run when things get too overwhelming. We understand these things, and these are a part of our mental health. Everything is about understanding who we are, because that's what gets us to the next level. Who we are will allow us to show up as leaders, community members, moms, dads, brothers, sisters. It's understanding who we are that impacts the overall system. That's the spare change I have for everyone.
I love it. Jason, thank you so much. I truly appreciate your time, your knowledge, and your expertise. You guys heard it here. Who we are is not who we can be. So be curious, challenge our thoughts, and really challenge whether or not our narratives are true. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Angela.